There is a specific kind of silence that drops over a room when a man's life is about to end. It doesn't sound like quiet. It sounds like a vacuum. It pulls the air from your lungs and the blood from your head. Nora knew that silence. She just never intended to be the one to break it. All she had to do was pour the damn vodka, keep her head down, and forget the Russian she learned from a dead mother. Instead, she opened her mouth. The air in the VIP lounge of the Sovereign tasted like stale tonic water, expensive cigars, and the metallic tang of unexpressed violence. Nora kept her eyes fixed on the damp towel in her hand. The polyester of her uniform blouse dug into her armpits, slick with cold sweat. It was 2:14 a.m. Her shift ended at 3, provided no one bled on the velvet upholstery. She wiped the brass rim of the low table, pressing hard enough that the friction burned the calluses on her palm. In her periphery, the polished leather shoes of men who owned the city shifted restlessly. There were 4 of them. 3 belonged to the local syndicate heavy men with thick necks and suits that cost more than Nora's annual rent. The 4th man sat slightly apart, reclined in a wingback chair that seemed to swallow the dim amber lighting. This was Kirill. She didn't know his last name. No one on the floor did. The bartenders just called him the architect, usually in a whisper, usually while checking over their shoulders. Kirill didn't look like a mob boss. He looked like a weary accountant forced to work the graveyard shift. He was thin, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks, his pale hair cropped close to his scalp. His knuckles were bruised a fading yellow-purple against his pale skin, but his hands rested perfectly still on his knees. Nora moved to the next table, dragging her plastic utility bin across the carpet. The heavy thrum of the bass from the main club floor vibrated up through the soles of her cheap orthotics, a relentless rhythm that usually numbed her brain. Tonight it just gave her a headache. "Tell him," one of the local heavyweights barked. His name was Russo, and he smelled like cheap cologne and garlic. "Tell the Russian we agree to the 20% cut, but the docks are ours. We control the shipping containers from Terminal 4. Beside Russo, a nervous, sweaty man in a wrinkled suit swallowed hard. He was the translator, a middleman hired to bridge the gap between Chicago muscle and Eastern European ice. The translator wiped his forehead with a crumpled napkin and turned to Kirill. Nora wasn't listening. She was trying to scrub a stubborn ring of dried whiskey off the glass table, but the words drifted over to her anyway. "Oni govoreat," the translator began his Russian clumsy, heavily accented, "Kto oddadut vam 20%, no terminal 4 prenadlezitim. Esli vines delki oni sozgut vashi skladi." Nora's hand froze. The rag slipped from her fingers, landing with a wet, pathetic slap against the glass. Her heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. "If you don't agree, they will burn your warehouses." That wasn't what Russo had said. Russo hadn't made a threat. He had just stated a boundary. The translator was freestyling, adding gasoline to a spark, just to see what would happen, or maybe he was paid by a third party to ensure this meeting ended in a bloodbath. Kirill's expression didn't change. Not a muscle twitched in his gaunt face. He simply tilted his head, his pale, exhausted eyes shifting from the translator to Russo. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. Nora knew that movement. She'd seen it before years ago in a dingy kitchen in Brighton Beach. It was the movement of a man reaching for a solution that made a very loud noise. Survival is an ugly, selfish instinct. It tells you to run, to hide, to let the world burn as long as you aren't in the flames. But Nora was tired. She was so unbelievably tired of the blood, the cleaning up, the constant suffocating fear that ruled her life. Before her brain could apply the brakes, her mouth opened. "On Lelzet," Nora said. "He is lying." The words hung in the air, foreign and sharp. The silence that followed was absolute. The bass from the floor below seemed to mute itself. Russo stopped chewing his gum. The translator turned to her, his face draining of all color, leaving him looking like a bloated corpse under the amber lights. Kirill's hand paused inside his jacket. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he turned his head to look at her. Nora felt the immediate violent urge to vomit. Her knees locked. She wanted to shrink into the cheap carpet, to become dust, to disappear. She hadn't spoken like a hero. Her voice had cracked thin and reedy like a frightened child's. "Что ты сказала?" Kirill asked. His voice was a rasp like sandpaper on dry wood. "What did you say?" Nora couldn't breathe. The smell of the bleach on her hands suddenly felt overpowering, burning her nasal passages. She looked down at her stained sneakers, her jaw trembling so hard her teeth clicked. He didn't say that," Nora whispered, switching back to English, her voice barely audible over the roaring in her ears. "He didn't say anything about burning warehouses. He just said they keep Terminal 4. The translator lunged forward, his face twisting in panicked rage. "Shut your mouth, you stupid bitch!" Kirill raised a single finger. The translator froze mid-step, as if hitting an invisible brick wall. Kirill didn't look at the translator. He didn't look at Russo. His pale, dead-eyed gaze remained entirely fixed on Nora. She felt stripped naked, dissected on a steel table. He looked at the frayed hem of her skirt, the rigid tension in her shoulders, the terrified white-knuckle grip she had on the handle of her plastic bucket. He pulled his hand from his jacket. It was empty. "Bring her to my office," Kirill said. His English was flawless, entirely devoid of an accent, flat and mechanical. He stood up, adjusted his cuffs, and walked out of the room without looking back. Panic is not a clean emotion. It does not give you clarity or a sudden surge of strength. It turns your bowels to water and makes your extremities feel like they are packed with wet sand. As two men stepped out from the shadows near the doorway, Nora couldn't fight. She didn't even try. One of them, a man with a nose that had been broken and reset off-center, grabbed her upper arm. His grip wasn't punishing, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a machine. "Walk," the man grunted. Nora stumbled. Her foot caught the edge of her utility bucket, knocking it over. A puddle of grey, soapy water spilled across the expensive carpet, soaking into the fibers. The smell of artificial pine masked the cigar smoke for a brief, absurd second. She wanted to apologize for the mess. The urge was so ingrained, so pathetic, that a hysterical bubble of laughter pushed up the back of her throat. She swallowed it down, tasting bile. They led her down a hallway she wasn't supposed to know existed. It was behind the service elevators, past a heavy steel door that required a keypad code and a thumbprint. The air back here was different. It didn't smell like the club. It smelled like industrial cleaning supplies, ozone from high-voltage servers, and the distinct dusty scent of old paper. The carpeting gave way to polished concrete that clicked loudly beneath the guards' leather shoes. Nora's rubber-soled sneakers just squeaked a high, humiliating sound that echoed off the bare walls. "I am going to die," she thought. The thought wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a dull, heavy stone sinking into her stomach. I spoke out of turn. I humiliated a translator. I inserted myself into syndicate business. She looked at the back of the guard walking in front of her. His suit jacket stretched taut across a massive back. She tried to think of her apartment. She had left a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the counter. The milk would sour. Her landlord would come looking for the rent on Tuesday, find the place empty, and throw her cheap clothes in the alley. That was the sum total of her existence. No one to call the police. No one to notice the gap she left behind. Her lungs felt too small. She dragged in a breath, but it didn't seem to contain any oxygen. Her fingers were numb, tingling unpleasantly. They reached a set of double doors made of frosted glass. There were no nameplates, no indications of what lay beyond. The guard holding her arm let go, stepping back. "In," the other guard said, gesturing with his chin. Nora hesitated. Her hand hovered over the brushed steel handle. It was freezing cold against her skin. She looked back at the two men. They weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking straight ahead, entirely disinterested in her fate. She was already a ghost to them. She pushed the door open. The office was massive, but it felt suffocatingly small because of the sheer density of the darkness. The only light came from a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows behind the desk, casting the sprawling, neon-soaked grid of the city into the room. The air conditioning was cranked so high the room felt like a meat locker. Nora shivered violently, her sweat-dampened blouse clinging to her spine like a second layer of freezing skin. Kirill was standing by the window, his back to her. He had taken off his jacket. His white dress shirt was crisp, fitting perfectly across his narrow shoulders. In the reflection of the glass, Nora could see the orange cherry of a cigarette burning between his fingers. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her in. The sound was final, a coffin lid shutting. She stood just inside the door, not daring to move. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the tremor in her legs. She wasn't brave. She didn't have a smart remark or a defiant glare. She was a waitress in a cheap uniform, smelling of pine cleaner and fear, waiting for a bullet. Minutes stretched. The silence in the room was dense, pressing against Nora's eardrums. She could hear the faint, high-pitched hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, bleeding through the door frame, and the erratic, thudding rhythm of her own heart. Kirill did not turn around. He took a drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing fiercely in the reflection of the glass, illuminating the sharp hollows of his face for a fraction of a second. He exhaled a thin stream of blue smoke against the window pane. "You are shaking," he said. His voice didn't carry the raw, gravelly texture it had in the lounge. In the quiet of the office, it was smooth quiet and terrifyingly calm. It sounded like an observation, not an accusation. Nora clamped her jaw shut, trying to still her chattering teeth. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, hugging herself tightly. "I'm cold," she lied. Her voice sounded foreign to her, thin and reedy. Kirill slowly turned around. He leaned his hip against the edge of his massive mahogany desk, tapping the ash of his cigarette into a crystal tray. He looked at her. Really looked at her. There was no predatory gleam in his eyes, no sadistic amusement. His expression was one of clinical detached curiosity. It was worse than anger. Anger could be reasoned with, begged with. Detachment meant you were already a statistic. "Who taught you to speak like a gutter rat from St. Petersburg?" he asked. Nora swallowed hard. Her throat felt coated in sand. "My mother," she managed to say. She was from there. Was. She died a long time ago. Kirill took another slow drag of his cigarette. "And yet you maintain the accent, the specific, vulgar phrasing of the dock workers. On lžet, not on neprav." He tilted his head. "You called him a liar with the inflection of a street thief." "Why, I don't know," Nora whispered. The truth was pathetic. It just came out. I wasn't thinking. People who do not think in my presence rarely leave it breathing. The words weren't delivered as a threat. They were stated as a simple fact, like noting the temperature outside. Nora's breath hitched. A single hot tear leaked out of the corner of her eye, tracking down her cheek. She hated herself for it. She hated her weakness. She wiped it away savagely with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. "I didn't mean to interfere," she said, her words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate stream. I heard what he was doing. He was trying to start a war. Russo didn't say anything about warehouses. The translator was trying to get them killed, trying to get you to kill them. I am aware of what the translator was doing," Kirill said softly. Nora froze. Her lungs stopped working entirely. She stared at him, trying to process the flat, emotionless statement. You knew. Of course I knew. Anatoly has been taking bribes from the O'Connor family for 6 months. Tonight was supposed to be his final performance. He was to incite a conflict. I was to eliminate the Italians, and the O'Connors would swoop into the vacuum. Kirill crushed his cigarette out in the tray, twisting the butt with meticulous precision. It was a very delicate ecosystem of deception. And then a woman, smelling of cheap bleach and panic, decided to play hero. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Nora's feet. She hadn't saved anyone. She hadn't stopped a misunderstanding. She had ruined a carefully orchestrated trap. I'm sorry. She gasped, her voice breaking. Oh God, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Please, I won't say anything. I'll quit. I'll leave the city. You'll never see me again. She was rambling, begging her pride entirely evaporated. She took a step back, her hand fumbling blindly behind her for the door handle. Kirill pushed off the desk. He closed the distance between them with a shocking, silent speed. He didn't run, but suddenly he was simply there, invading her space, blocking the door. Nora slammed back against the frosted glass, a startled gasp tearing from her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away, waiting for the blow. Waiting for the cold steel of a barrel against her temple. It didn't come. Instead, she felt the faint displacement of air as he leaned in. He smelled like tobacco, expensive wool, and a faint, sharp scent like crushed mint. "Open your eyes," he ordered. The command was low, thrumming in his chest. Nora shook her head, terrified. "Open them, Zaychik, little rabbit." The Russian endearment sounded mocking on his tongue. Slowly her eyelashes fluttered apart. Kirill was mere inches from her face. His pale eyes were no longer dead. They were searching, dissecting her expression, looking for a lie, looking for a hidden agenda. He raised a hand. Nora flinched violently, shrinking against the door, but his hand bypassed her face, resting flat against the glass beside her head, caging her in. "You ruined my trap," Kirill murmured, his gaze dropping to her trembling mouth, then back up to her terrified eyes. "Which means I now have a mess to clean up. Anatoly is currently having his fingers broken in the basement to find out exactly what the O'Connors promised him. The Italians are confused and paranoid. My evening is ruined. I'm sorry," she whispered again, the only words she seemed capable of forming. "Stop apologizing." He snapped, a sudden harsh flash of irritation breaking through his icy veneer. "It is pathetic." He leaned closer until his lips were a breath away from her ear. "You speak my language. You understand the dialects of the filth I deal with. You hear things people think you are too stupid to comprehend." He pulled back just enough to hold her gaze. "You are not going to quit. You are not going to leave the city," Kirill said. "From now on, you don't clean tables. You stand behind me, you listen, and you tell me every lie they try to sell me." Nora stared at him, her mind blanking. "What? You are mine now," Kirill stated, turning away from her and walking back toward his desk. He didn't ask. It wasn't an offer. "Report here tomorrow at 8 in the evening. Wear something that doesn't smell like a hospital floor." The morning light in Nora's apartment was never really light. It was a bruised, smog-filtered grey that crawled through the single window and highlighted the water stains on the ceiling. She lay flat on her mattress, staring at a patch of peeling paint shaped vaguely like a lung. She had not slept. Every time her eyes closed, the heavy click of the frosted glass door echoed in her skull, followed by the flat, dead-eyed stare of the man who now owned her. "You are mine now." It was Tuesday. The landlord would be by for the rent at noon. She rolled over the cheap springs of the mattress, groaning beneath her, and picked up her phone from the floor. Her banking app loaded with agonizing slowness. Available balance $42.18. The urge to run was a physical ache in her calves, a tightening in her hamstrings. She could pack her duffel bag walk to the Greyhound station and get on a bus heading west. She could disappear into Iowa or Nebraska or somewhere flat and empty where men in charcoal suits didn't exist. But a bus ticket cost $50, and men like Kirill didn't lose things they had claimed. If she ran, she would just be a target, constantly looking over her shoulder, until the day a man with a broken nose stepped out of an alley and snapped her neck. At least here, in the terrifying proximity of the fire, she could see the flames. She dragged herself out of bed. The floorboards were freezing. The air in the apartment smelled like old cooking oil and damp brick. She walked to the bathroom and turned on the shower, waiting a full 5 minutes for the water to transition from freezing to a tepid, rusty lukewarm. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, trying to wash away the phantom scent of artificial pine cleaner and stale cigar smoke. It didn't work. The smell was lodged in her sinuses, a permanent reminder of the VIP lounge. At 3 p.m., she walked to a discount department store 3 blocks down the avenue. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped flies. She navigated the crowded aisles, searching for something that fit the impossible criteria of not smelling like a hospital floor, but not looking like she was trying to impress a mobster. She settled on a simple, long-sleeved black sheath dress. It was made of a heavy synthetic blend that felt slightly rough against her palms. The tag at the collar scratched the back of her neck when she tried it on in the cramped dressing room. It was unremarkable. It was camouflage. She paired it with plain black flats that pinched her toes, just enough to be a constant dull distraction. The total came to $38.50. By the time she walked back out onto the street, the wind off Lake Michigan had picked up, slicing through her thin coat. She arrived at the Sovereign at 7:45 p.m. The main entrance was locked, the heavy velvet ropes strung across the brass stanchions. The club wouldn't open to the public for another 2 hours. She walked down the alley to the heavy steel service door. Her hand hovered over the buzzer. The metal of the intercom was cold beaded with condensation. She swallowed the thick knot of dread in her throat and pressed the button. A burst of static crackled. "Yeah, it's Nora," she said. Her voice sounded small against the rumble of a passing garbage truck. I was told to be here at 8. Silence. A long, agonizing stretch of it. Then a heavy mechanical clunk echoed from the door. She pushed it open and stepped into the service corridor. The air immediately changed. It was climate-controlled, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive floor wax. A man she didn't recognize was standing by the security desk. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore a tactical black sweater and cargo pants. He looked at her, his eyes scanning her from the pinched toes of her new flats to the stiff collar of the black dress. He didn't say a word. He just jerked his chin toward the back hallway. Nora walked. Her new shoes squeaked slightly on the polished concrete. The sound made her flinch every time. She felt like a trespasser in her own life. She reached the frosted glass double doors. The hallway was empty. The high-pitched hum of the servers in the nearby IT room vibrated in her teeth. She stood there for a full minute, her hands trembling by her sides. She tried to take a deep breath, but her ribs felt like iron bands tightening around her lungs. She raised a knuckle and tapped on the glass. "Enter," a voice called out from the other side. Nora pushed the handle down. The door swung open smoothly, silencing the hum of the hallway and plunging her into the freezing, quiet expanse of the office. The room was exactly as she remembered it, dark and sprawling, illuminated mostly by the neon glow of the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Kirill was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. He wasn't looking at documents or a computer screen. He was eating. It was a stark, almost depressing sight. On a bone-white china plate sat a single piece of dry, burnt toast. Next to it was a small espresso cup. No butter, no jam. He took a bite of the toast, the dry crunch echoing loudly in the silent room, and chewed with slow, methodical precision. He didn't look up when the door clicked shut behind her. Nora stood near the entrance, unsure of what to do with her hands. She clasped them in front of her, then moved them behind her back, finally settling on letting them hang awkwardly at her sides. The collar of the synthetic dress scratched the sensitive skin at the nape of her neck. "Sit," Kirill said. He gestured vaguely with a thin, pale hand to a leather wingback chair positioned slightly behind and to the left of his desk. It was an observer's seat, a shadow's seat. Nora walked over, her legs stiff. She sank into the chair. The leather was cold and stiff. From this angle she had a clear view of the two empty chairs positioned directly in front of the desk and a side profile of Kirill's face. The exhaustion she had noticed the night before was even more pronounced in the ambient light. The skin under his eyes was bruised a deep, heavy violet. The sharp lines of his jaw looked like they had been carved from marble, completely devoid of softness. He finished the toast, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and took a sip of the black coffee. In 10 minutes, a man named Bennett is going to walk through that door. Kirill said, his voice quiet, projecting perfectly across the space between them. He controls the unions that load the freight trains on the south side. He is bringing a man with him, a linguist he hired from a university. Nora's stomach clenched. A university linguist, someone who actually knew the language, who had degrees and studied the grammar. She was a waitress whose mother used to curse at her in a cramped kitchen when the water bill was late. I don't know formal Russian," Nora stammered, panic rising in her chest. "If they speak formally, I might not understand the terminology." Kirill turned his head, pinning her with a flat, unblinking stare. "Bennett is a thug who wears $1,000 suits to hide the fact that he used to break kneecaps with a lead pipe. His linguist is a coward who thinks learning a language from a textbook makes him worldly. They will lie. The linguist will dress the lies in polite grammar." He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "You are not here to translate their vocabulary. You are here to translate their intent. You will listen to the hesitation. You will listen to the phrasing. When the linguist speaks, you will tell me what he is actually saying, not what Bennett told him to say." "And if I'm wrong," Nora whispered, her fingernails digging into the leather armrests. "Then I lose money," Kirill said softly. "And I do not tolerate losing money." A sharp knock rattled the frosted glass. "Enter!" Kirill called out, his tone instantly shifting from quiet instruction to a chilling, commanding bark. The door opened. 2 men walked in. The first man, Bennett, filled the doorway. He was broad-shouldered and thick-waisted. His face flushed a permanent, unhealthy red. He smelled heavily of expensive, spicy aftershave and anxious sweat. The man behind him was thin, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket that looked absurdly out of place in the sterile, modern office. The linguist. Bennett walked straight to the chairs in front of the desk and sat down without being offered a seat. The linguist hovered nervously behind him. Kirill didn't offer a greeting. He just stared at Bennett, waiting. Bennett cleared his throat, the sound thick and wet. He glanced at Nora, sitting in the shadows. A flicker of confusion crossed his flushed face, but he quickly dismissed her as insignificant. Kirill Bennett started plastering on a wide, artificial smile. "Good to see you. Glad we could arrange this." Kirill said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive. Bennett's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching as the silence dragged on for 10 seconds, then 20. Finally, Bennett shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking loudly. He cleared his throat again and looked at his linguist. "Tell him we are ready to move his product, but the railway fees went up. We need a larger percentage to cover the administrative costs." The linguist adjusted his glasses. He looked terrified. He cleared his throat and spoke his Russian, slow, heavily enunciated, and painfully formal. My gotowi transportirować wasz gruz. Однако тарифи на железнодорожні перевозки возросли. Нам требується більший процент для покриття адміністративних розходів. It was a perfect textbook translation. Kirill did not look at the linguist. He slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at Nora. The room waited. The air conditioning kicked on a low rumble that sounded like distant thunder. Nora felt 3 pairs of eyes on her. Her throat seized up. She swallowed desperately, trying to find moisture that wasn't there. She looked at the linguist. She remembered the way he had hesitated on the word возросли, increased. It hadn't sounded like a statement of fact. It had sounded like a question, an apology. She looked at Bennett, who was gripping the armrests of his chair, tight enough to turn his knuckles white. Speak, Kirill commanded, his voice, a soft, dangerous whip crack in the quiet room. Nora opened her mouth. Her voice shook raw and unpolished. The words are right, she said, staring at the floor. But he doesn't believe them. Bennett frowned, snapping his head toward her. What the hell is she talking about? Keep speaking, Kirill said to Nora, ignoring Bennett entirely. The translator. Nora said, forcing herself to look at Kirill's pale, cold eyes. He said the fees went up, but he said it like he was apologizing for a lie. It's an excuse. The fees didn't go up. He just wants more money. Bennett slammed his fist onto the desk. The crystal ashtray rattled. Listen here, you piece of... Quiet, Kirill said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move aggressively. But the word dropped into the room like a physical weight, crushing the air out of Bennett's lungs. Bennett froze, his red face turning a darker, mottled shade of purple. Kirill turned his attention back to the union boss. My translator believes you are lying, Mr. Bennett. She believes you are attempting to extort me. She's a stupid waitress. Bennett spat, pointing a thick, trembling finger at Nora. She doesn't know what she's talking about. My guy here has a master's degree in Slavic languages. Kirill looked at the linguist, who had gone completely pale, sweat beading on his upper lip. Tell me, Kirill said to the linguist, switching to flawless, unaccented English. Did the fees increase? Or did Mr. Bennett tell you to say they did, to justify a higher cut? The linguist opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Bennett with wide, terrified eyes. Answer him, Bennett growled. The linguist flinched. I just translate what I am told. Kirill nodded slowly. He reached into the top drawer of his desk. Violence, Nora realized in that exact fracturing second, is not cinematic. It does not happen in slow motion. It is abrupt, ugly, and obscenely loud. Kirill didn't stand up. He didn't yell a threat. He simply withdrew a compact, matte black handgun from the drawer, leveled it across the polished mahogany, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The sound was apocalyptic in the enclosed office. It was a physical force that slapped Nora across the face, rattling her teeth in her gums and sending a spike of agonizing pressure into her eardrums. A flash of yellow fire illuminated the dark room for a microsecond. The smell hit her next. It wasn't just sulfur and burnt gunpowder. It was sharp, acrid, like striking 1,000 matches at once in a tiny closet. Bennett didn't scream immediately. The bullet had caught him in the meat of his left shoulder, tearing through the expensive wool of his suit and blowing a ragged hole through the back of the chair. For a second, there was only the deafening, high-pitched ringing in Nora's ears. She pressed her hands over the sides of her head, her breath locking in her chest, her eyes wide with a terror so absolute it paralyzed her vocal cords. Then Bennett began to scream. It was a wet, gurgling howl of shock and agony. He pitched sideways, clutching his shoulder, his heavy body rolling off the chair and crashing onto the floor. Dark, thick blood immediately began pooling on the pristine rug, a terrifyingly rapid spread of crimson. The linguist threw himself to the ground, curling into a fetal position, sobbing hysterically, his hands clasped over his head. Kirill remained exactly where he was. He placed the smoking gun on the desk right next to his empty espresso cup. His expression hadn't shifted a fraction of an inch. The deep, violet bruises under his eyes looked identical. The line of his mouth was perfectly flat. He leaned forward, looking over the edge of the desk at Bennett, who was writhing and hyperventilating on the floor. "The railway fees remain the same," Kirill said, his voice entirely calm, easily, cutting through the man's wet, ragged screams. "You will load my freight. You will take the original percentage. If you attempt to alter the arrangement again, the next round goes through your throat. Nod if you understand." Bennett gasped, choking on his own spit, his face grey with shock. He nodded frantically, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Yes," he wheezed, spit flying from his lips. "Yes, God. Yes." "Excellent," Kirill said. He looked at the sobbing linguist. "Take your employer to a private physician. If he bleeds on the carpets in the hallway, I will have you killed. Leave." The linguist scrambled up his hands, shaking so violently he could barely grab Bennett's uninjured arm. With frantic, desperate strength, fueled entirely by panic, he hauled the heavier man to his feet. Bennett groaned, clutching his ruined shoulder, blood dripping rapidly onto the floor in heavy, dark splatters. They staggered toward the door, leaving a horrific, wet trail behind them. The door clicked shut. The silence rushed back in, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the ragged, shallow gasps of Nora's own breathing. She was frozen in the leather chair. Her hands were clamped over her ears so tightly her knuckles were white. Her chest heaved, but she couldn't seem to draw in enough air. The metallic, sweet copper smell of the blood on the rug hit the back of her throat, and her stomach violently revolted. She leaned over the side of the chair, clapping a hand over her mouth, gagging dryly. Her entire body shook a violent, involuntary tremor that rattled her bones. She had wiped up blood before. She had cleaned the aftermath. But being in the room when the skin tore and the bone splintered, feeling the pressure of the gunshot against her eardrums, was a trauma that fractured the flimsy architecture of her survival instincts. She heard the squeak of leather. Kirill stood up from his desk. He walked around the pool of blood with casual grace, his polished shoes stepping carefully over the crimson droplets. He approached her chair. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, shrinking back against the leather, terrified he was going to turn that cold, mechanical violence on her. She squeezed her arms around her ribs, trying to make herself as small as possible. A shadow fell over her. She waited for the blow. She waited for the gun. Instead, a glass touched her trembling knee. She opened her eyes, gasping. Kirill was standing over her. He was holding a crystal tumbler filled with water. He didn't look angry. He didn't look sympathetic either. He looked down at her with that same detached, clinical curiosity. "Take it," he said softly. Nora unclasped her hands from her ribs. Her fingers were stiff, cramping from tension. She reached for the glass. Her hand was shaking so badly that the water sloshed over the rim, spilling onto her new black dress and chilling her skin. She gripped it with both hands, bringing it to her mouth. The rim clattered against her teeth. She forced down a swallow. It felt like swallowing ground glass, but the cold water shocked her system just enough to push the nausea back down. Kirill watched her drink. He reached out his hand, moving slowly, deliberately, giving her time to flinch away. She didn't. She was too exhausted. His fingers, long, pale, surprisingly warm, brushed against the side of her head, tucking a loose, sweat-dampened strand of hair behind her ear. The touch was incredibly light, completely at odds with the brutal violence he had just committed. "You did well," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "You heard the lie. You didn't choke." Nora lowered the glass, staring up at him. You shot him." Her voice was a broken whisper. "Over a lie." "I shot him over disrespect," Kirill corrected smoothly. He dropped his hand, taking a step back. The lie was merely the vehicle. In this room, words have weight, Nora. Tonight your words had the weight of a bullet. He turned his back on her, walking toward the window to look out over the glittering grid of the city. "Clean yourself up," he said, not looking at her. "We have another meeting at midnight." By 11:30 p.m. the blood was gone. Nora watched from her leather chair in the corner as two men in grey coveralls worked with industrial efficiency. They didn't speak. They didn't look at her or at Kirill, who was reading a leather-bound ledger at his desk. They sprayed a foaming chemical onto the dark stain on the carpet, scrubbed it with stiff, bristled brushes, and used a wet vac that shrieked like a dying animal to pull the moisture from the fibers. The air in the office now smelled violently of ammonia and artificial lemon. It burned the inside of Nora's nose, fighting the lingering metallic ghost of the gunshot. She hadn't moved in an hour. Her legs were cramped, a dull ache throbbing in her calves. The spilled water on her black synthetic dress had dried, leaving a stiff, cold patch against her thigh. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean from the inside. The panic had burned itself out, leaving behind a heavy narcotic exhaustion. The cleaners packed up their equipment and left the heavy frosted doors clicking shut with that same terrible finality. Kirill closed his ledger. The sound of the thick paper snapping shut made Nora flinch. He didn't look up immediately. He reached for a fresh pack of cigarettes on his desk, his long fingers tearing the cellophane wrapper with quiet precision. "You are breathing too shallowly," he said. The flick of his lighter illuminated the sharp planes of his face. "You will pass out if you do not force oxygen into your blood." Nora realized her jaw was locked. She forced her mouth open, drawing in a shaky, rattling breath of the lemon-scented air. It tasted like poison. "I can't," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, unused. "I can't do this again." "You already have," Kirill replied smoothly. He stood up, walking around the desk. He didn't approach her this time. He walked to the window, leaning his shoulder against the thick glass, looking out over the grid of streetlights. The first time you see a man broken, it shatters the illusion of safety you have built for yourself. You realize the police are minutes away when seconds matter. You realize the social contract is a piece of paper, and paper burns. He took a drag of his cigarette. "The second time it is merely data. You learn to process it." "He was screaming," she said, staring at the empty space on the floor where Bennett had writhed. "He was bleeding," Kirill corrected. "Screaming is just air. Blood is consequence." He turned to look at her. His pale eyes were entirely devoid of empathy, but they held a strange, clinical focus. He wasn't trying to scare her. He was trying to recalibrate her. "At midnight, a man named Gallagher is coming." Kirill said, his tone shifting to business. "He represents the O'Connor Syndicate. He is smart, he is quiet, and he does not yell. He will bring a translator. A woman this time. An older woman who speaks the Moscow dialect." Nora's stomach gave a weak, pathetic flutter. "What do you want me to do?" "Gallagher is going to offer me peace," Kirill said. "He is going to say the O'Connors had nothing to do with Anatoly the translator from last night. He will offer a concession, a gesture of goodwill, the docks, perhaps, or the trucking routes." Kirill walked to his desk and crushed the cigarette into the crystal tray. "I need you to tell me what the gesture actually is. Is it an apology, or is it a distraction while they arm their men?" Nora swallowed hard. "How am I supposed to know that by listening to the spaces between the words?" Kirill said softly. "The Moscow dialect is arrogant. It hides insults in honorifics. Listen to how she addresses me. Listen to how Gallagher breathes when she speaks. People who are lying hold their breath. People who are telling the truth exhale." A soft chime echoed from the phone on Kirill's desk. Midnight. "Stand up," Kirill ordered. Nora forced her legs to work. Her knees trembled, popping loudly in the quiet room. She stood, grabbing the back of the leather chair to steady herself. "Stand behind me," he said. She moved. She stood 2 feet behind his right shoulder. She was no longer an observer in the corner. She was his shadow. She was part of the architecture of his power. The realization made her want to vomit again, but she clamped her jaw shut. The door opened. Gallagher was a tall, unnervingly thin man with silver hair and a bespoke navy suit. He walked with a cane, though he didn't seem to lean on it. Beside him was a woman in her late 50s, dressed in a severe grey skirt suit, her hair pulled back into a painfully tight bun. They sat down in the chairs. Gallagher smiled. It was a pleasant, grandfatherly smile that didn't reach his cold, slate-grey eyes. "Kirill Kyato." Gallagher said, his voice a rich, soothing baritone. "A terrible business last night. A terrible misunderstanding." Kirill sat motionless. He didn't blink. "Proceed." Gallagher nodded, his smile never wavering. "We want to make amends. We had no idea Anatoly was acting on his own to destabilize our working relationship. To show our sincerity, the O'Connor family is prepared to concede the routing tariffs for the inbound freight through the West Side." Gallagher looked at the older woman. She didn't look at Kirill. She looked at the desk. "Semja O'Connor gotowa ustupit wam marszrutnie taryfa dla wchodzących gruzów na zapadnej stronie," she said. Her voice was clipped, precise, and flawlessly accented. "W kачестве жеста уважения к вашему управлению." Nora listened. She listened to the Russian. She heard the vocabulary. "As a gesture of respect to your management." But that wasn't what it meant. In the high, arrogant dialect of the Moscow elite, the word the woman used for management, upravlenию, was technically correct. But the way she paused before it, the microscopic sneer in her tone, changed the context. She didn't mean a corporate structure. She meant a temporary occupation. She meant a fiefdom that was allowed to exist for now. Nora looked at Gallagher. His hands were folded over the silver head of his cane. His knuckles were white. He wasn't breathing. Kirill didn't look back at Nora. He simply waited. Nora leaned forward, her mouth inches from Kirill's ear. She could smell the mint and the tobacco on his skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when she spoke, was surprisingly steady. "It's a distraction." Nora whispered the English words, slipping out in a quiet hiss. "She insulted you. She called your territory temporary, and he is bracing himself for you to accept the lie." Kirill didn't react physically, but Nora felt the immediate, terrifying drop in the temperature of the room. It was as if the air had been sucked out into a vacuum. "Gallagher," Kirill said softly. The older man's smile remained frozen. "Yes, Kirill. If your men are currently moving on my warehouses on the west side while we speak," Kirill said, his voice entirely flat, "I am going to have you beaten to death with your own cane." Gallagher's eyes widened. The grandfatherly mask slipped, revealing a flash of absolute naked panic. The older woman gasped, her rigid posture crumbling as she recoiled into her chair. "I don't know what your translator is telling you," Gallagher stammered, gripping the cane tightly. "But she is mistaken. We are offering peace." "My translator," Kirill said, leaning forward slowly, "does not make mistakes." He pressed a button under the lip of his desk. Within 3 seconds, the heavy frosted door swung open. 2 men walked in. They were the men from the hallway. They didn't have guns drawn, but the violence in their posture was undeniable. "Take them to the basement," Kirill ordered. "Find out how many men they sent to the west side. Break whatever you need to break." Gallagher didn't fight. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a wax corpse. The older woman began to weep, a quiet, pathetic sound. They were hauled out of the chairs and dragged from the room. The doors clicked shut. Nora stood frozen. She had just sentenced 2 people to the basement. She had just ordered violence as surely as if she had held the gun herself. She looked at her trembling hands. They didn't feel like her hands anymore. Kirill turned his chair slightly to face her. "Sit down, Nora," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, heavy and deliberate. She collapsed into the leather chair, her legs completely giving out. "You are crying," he observed, leaning his elbows on the desk. She touched her cheek. It was wet. She hadn't even realized the tears were falling. "I'm a monster," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just helped you hurt them." "You survived," Kirill corrected gently. It was the softest tone she had heard him use. "If you had stayed quiet, I would have accepted the concession. His men would have burned my warehouses, killed my workers, and tomorrow Gallagher would have returned to finish me. And you," he picked up his espresso cup, though it had to be cold by now. "You did not invent the violence, Nora. You merely navigated it." Time in Kirill's orbit did not pass in days. It passed in meetings, in quiet threats, in the endless translation of deceit. 3 weeks bled by. Nora no longer lived in the damp apartment with the peeling paint. 3 days after the Gallagher incident, a man had arrived at her door, packed her meager belongings into a single bag, and drove her to a high-rise downtown. The new apartment was on the 42nd floor. It was all glass, steel, and cold grey slate. It smelled like nothing. It was pristine, silent, and completely alien. Her closet was filled with clothes she hadn't bought. Tailored silk blouses, wool trousers, cashmere coats. They were all in muted tones, black charcoal slate. The uniform of a ghost. She hated the silk. It was too soft. It didn't provide the scratchy synthetic friction of her cheap waitress dress. It felt like a second skin, a constant reminder that she had been bought, scrubbed, clean, and repurposed. She spent her nights standing behind the mahogany desk. She learned the subtle, terrifying language of Kirill's world. She learned that a man who speaks too fast is desperate, and a man who speaks too slow is hiding a knife. She learned that Kirill never raised his voice because a man who controls the room never has to shout to be heard. She also learned that the architect was dying. She noticed it during a late-night negotiation with a Colombian supplier. Kirill was speaking his English, flawless and precise, when a sudden violent spasm racked his chest. He turned his head away, coughing into a white linen handkerchief. The sound was wet, ragged, and deep in his lungs. When he pulled the handkerchief away, Nora, standing directly behind him, saw the bright, unmistakable smear of arterial blood on the white linen. He crumpled the fabric in his fist and seamlessly continued the conversation, his voice never wavering. No one else in the room noticed, but Nora did. Later that night, after the suppliers had left and the office was silent, Kirill poured himself a glass of whiskey. He didn't drink it. He just held the heavy crystal in his pale hands. He looked worse than usual. The hollows of his cheeks were sunken, the skin beneath his eyes bruised, almost black. Nora stood by the door, waiting to be dismissed. "You saw," he said to the window. Nora didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." He turned to look at her. "Does it bring you comfort, knowing the monster has an expiration date?" Nora swallowed. She stepped away from the door, moving further into the freezing room. "Are you seeing a doctor?" "Doctors require trust," Kirill said softly, his lips twisting into a humorless smile. "I do not deal in trust. I deal in leverage. A doctor can be bought. A medical record can be weaponized. So you're just going to bleed to death into expensive napkins?" she asked. The bluntness of her own voice shocked her. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have dared to breathe too loudly in his presence. Now she was challenging him. Kirill's eyes flared, a brief spark of anger or amusement, she couldn't tell which. He set the whiskey down. "It is an old wound," he said quietly. "From a time before I wore suits, it occasionally decides to remind me that it exists." He walked toward her, stopping a few feet away. "You did not answer my question, Nora. Does it bring you comfort?" She looked at him. She looked at the man who had shot a union boss in front of her, who had sent people to be tortured. She should hate him. She should pray for his lungs to fill with blood. But as she looked at his exhausted, sharp face, she felt a terrifying, shameful twist of something else in her chest. Not affection. Never affection. But a dark, twisted gravity. He was the anchor, holding her in a storm he had created. "No," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't bring me comfort, because if you die, the men who want this room will kill me just for standing behind your chair." Kirill stared at her for a long time. The silence between them was no longer oppressive. It was heavy with a mutual, terrible understanding. Slowly he reached out. His knuckles brushed against the lapel of her expensive wool jacket. "Then you had better ensure I stay alive, Zaychik," he murmured. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday in November. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows was obscured by a blinding, driving blizzard. The snow beat against the thick glass, muffling the sounds of the street below. The office, however, was suffocatingly hot. For the first time, Kirill had allowed the heat to be turned up. He was sitting behind his desk, looking paler than the snow outside. His breathing was shallow, his lips a faint shade of blue. Sitting across from him was Declan O'Connor, the head of the Irish syndicate, Liam's older brother. Declan wasn't a thug like Bennett, nor an emissary like Gallagher. He was royalty in the underworld. He wore a tweed three-piece suit that looked perfectly tailored, and he smiled with his eyes. He had brought two men with him, both built like brick walls, standing silently by the door. He had also brought a translator, a young, sharp-looking man from Kiev. Nora stood behind Kirill. She was wearing a high-necked black silk blouse. Her hands were clasped tightly behind her back, her fingernails biting into her palms. She could hear the faint, wet rattle in Kirill's chest every time he inhaled. "The terms are simple," Kirill Declan said, his Irish lilt thick and musical. "You pull your distribution out of the south side, and we ignore the unfortunate incident with my man Gallagher. We call it a wash. We respect the new borders." Declan nodded to his translator. The young man from Kiev leaned forward. "Uslovia prosti. Wy ubierajecie swoje rozpredelenie z jużnej strony, a my ignorujem incident z Gallagherem. My uważajem nowe granice." It was a direct translation. Perfect grammar. No hidden insults. No arrogant pauses. Kirill coughed a dry, weak sound. He reached for his handkerchief, his hand trembling slightly. Declan's smile widened just a fraction of an inch. He saw the weakness. He smelled the blood in the water. Nora saw it too, but she wasn't looking at Declan. She was looking at the young translator from Kiev. The man was sweating. His eyes kept darting to the crystal ashtray on Kirill's desk, then to the floor, then back to Declan. He was holding his breath. People who are lying hold their breath. Nora closed her eyes for a split second, replaying the Russian words in her head. My uważajem nowe granice. We respect the new borders. It was too clean. It was rehearsed. She looked at the two massive guards standing by the frosted doors. Their hands were resting casually over the buttons of their suit jackets, but their stances were wide, braced. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution. Declan wasn't here to draw borders. He was here to watch Kirill bleed out or to speed up the process. Kirill lowered his handkerchief. He looked at Nora over his shoulder. His eyes were clouded with pain, but the silent question was there. What do you hear? Nora didn't whisper in his ear this time. She unclasped her hands from behind her back. She stepped out from the shadow of the wingback chair, moving to stand directly beside Kirill's desk. She placed her hands flat on the polished mahogany, leaning forward. Declan frowned, his musical smile faltering. "What is this? Tell your pet to step back." Nora ignored him. She locked eyes with the young translator from Kiev. When she spoke, she didn't use the clumsy, hesitant Russian of a frightened waitress. She didn't use the polite, formal tone of a textbook. She reached back into her memory, pulling up the harsh, guttural street-level Russian her mother used when she was backed into a corner and fighting for her life. It was a dialect of survival. "Tai potiyesh, malchik," Nora said, her voice ringing out clear and sharp in the heavy air. "You are sweating, boy." The translator flinched as if she had slapped him. His mouth dropped open. Nora didn't stop. She kept her eyes pinned to his, her voice rising, commanding the room. "Tvoj boss приходит сюда с улыбкой, но твои руки дрожат. Ты знаешь, что здесь произойдет. Ты знаешь, что он принес оружие в эту комнату. Если они достанут стволы, ты будешь первым, кто умрет. Кирилл пробьет твою голову до того, как твой босс успеет моргнуть. Your boss comes here with a smile, but your hands are shaking. You know what is going to happen here. You know he brought weapons into this room. If they pull their guns, you will be the first to die. Kirill will put a bullet through your head before your boss can blink." The silence that followed was absolute. The rattle in Kirill's chest stopped. Declan looked confused, looking back and forth between his terrified translator and Nora. What the hell did she just say? The young translator from Kiev was hyperventilating. He looked at Kirill, who, despite his pale face, had his right hand resting casually inside his open jacket. The boy broke. "They have guns!" the translator screamed in heavily accented English, throwing himself backward out of his chair, scrambling across the floor toward the corner. "He told me to distract you. The guards have guns." Chaos erupted in a fraction of a second. Declan roared, reaching into his coat. The two guards at the door lunged forward, hands plunging into their jackets, but Kirill was already moving. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by the mechanical, terrifying speed of a predator. His hand blurred from his jacket. Bang, bang. The acoustics of the violence were identical to the first night. The crushing sound, the smell of sulfur. One guard dropped instantly, a hole between his eyes. The second guard managed to clear his weapon, but Kirill's third shot shattered his collarbone, spinning him to the ground in a spray of red. Declan froze. He had his gun halfway out of his holster. Kirill's weapon was leveled directly at the Irishman's forehead. A wisp of smoke curled from the barrel. "Drop it, Declan," Kirill said. His voice was no longer weak. It was steel. Declan swallowed hard. The gun slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the thick rug. He raised his hands, his face a mask of furious, impotent rage. Nora hadn't flinched. She hadn't covered her ears. She stood by the desk, her hand still flat on the mahogany, the smell of gunpowder washing over her. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. She looked down at the young translator, cowering in the corner, sobbing. She felt nothing for him. She looked at Declan, standing with his hands raised, his empire crumbling in the span of 10 seconds. Then she looked at Kirill. He didn't look at the men bleeding on the floor. He didn't look at Declan. He was looking at Nora. The gun was still raised, but his pale eyes were wide, taking in the posture of the woman standing beside him. The black silk, the steady hands, the ruthless fluency of her tongue. She wasn't just his translator anymore. She was his shield, his weapon. "Tell him," Kirill said softly, never breaking eye contact with Nora, "that the O'Connor family no longer exists in this city. Tell him he leaves Chicago tonight, or he dies in this room." Nora turned her head slowly to look at Declan. The Irishman was staring at her, a profound, dawning horror in his eyes. He realized in that moment who was actually controlling the temperature of the room. Nora didn't use Russian. She spoke in perfect icy English, her voice devoid of the tremor that had defined her weeks ago. "You heard the architect," Nora said, her voice echoing in the gun-smoke-filled air. "Get out!" She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't a hostage. She was fluent in the language of monsters, and she had just decided to become one. Nora walked into that office as a sacrifice, and walked out as a queen on a board built of blood and secrets. She proved that the most dangerous weapon in a Mafia war isn't a gun, it's a woman who knows exactly when to speak and exactly what to say. But the closer she gets to Kirill, the deeper she falls into a darkness she can never wash off. If you were captivated by Nora's terrifying evolution and want more dark psychological underworld stories, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter. Drop a comment below. Did Nora lose her humanity, or did she just find her true self? Share this video, and I'll see you in the next dark tale.